Welcome to And It's Live, the podcast which dives deep into football's most iconic seasons, stories, and what ifs. If you love football, history, tactics, and nostalgia, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and drop us a like on YouTube so you don't miss an episode. Hello and welcome to the main event in the history of the Champions League. I am Martin Ramsey, your host. As always, this is show 72 of 75. We are nearly done. It's the final season of our history, 2013, 14, La Decima, etc., etc. Adam's here, how are we doing?
I thought 30 shows was going to be taking the piss, but 72 is bordering on obscene. If there is anybody still listening from the very start, I salute you.
Salute your indefatigability. David, how are we doing?
Yes, I too salute your indefatigable Whitbread.
13-14 then. Notable. I quite like looking at the league route because the Champions Path is always pretty simple in terms of the qualifiers. But we've got PSV against Milan coming through in the end. But Adam, Lyon, such a fixture of our conversations over the months and years that we've been doing this, utterly scudded 2-0, 2-0 home and away by Real Sociedad. A young Antoine Griezmann on one side, I think, Carlos Vela, I think, on the other, doing lots of things. That surprised me. I'll be honest, I'd completely forgotten about that. Sociedad, spoiler alert, I'm not going to set this Champions League season ablaze, but something different to talk about in a season where we genuinely are going to have something different to talk about in Spanish football.
Yeah, Lyon, big favourite of ours, I guess. Coming up for 10 years ago now. I'm not sure when the last time they would have actually won it. At the time of, I was going to say time of recording, but it would not be time of recording. It would be time of playing. I think you're probably about 5 or 6 years at least from memory. So it's still a bit of a surprise, I guess. Sociedad, not exactly Champions League royalty. I don't think if we have any Sociedad fans that will be listening, hopefully they're not offended by the facts. I can't claim to know much. I can't claim that Jagoba Arasati, as was the coach that year for Real Sociedad, is someone that I have done lots of tactical deep dives in. Maybe if he'd have been a 1996 CSKA Moscow manager when we were still in the infancy of this, I might have dug in a little bit more. But he wasn't. He's a Mallorca manager now, but he wasn't someone that really crossed my path at this time in his solitary season at Sociedad. They've always had that intrigue, I think, for me. Sociedad, not quite as zealous, is that the word, with their Basque only policy as their neighbours. But it was always interesting, I think, growing up playing Football Manager, and I would have naturally went to Sociedad with the blue and white strips, obviously. So it was always interesting doing those games there, but they're not quite as strict on it as Bilbao. But it is still an interesting little quirk, I think, of modern football that you've got these teams that can still compete at very high levels with such signing policies. So I like I said, I can't claim to know much about them. They do have Griezmann, they do have Carlos Vela of, can we say Arsenal fame? I'm not sure, but he certainly was at Arsenal for a bit. Infamy, yeah. And yeah, decent. That is a surprise, I think, overall for me, but maybe not when you dig into Lyon's misfortunes.
Okay, let's get cracking then with the actual group stage. Davy, from one Davy to another. Davy Moyes is in charge of Manchester United FC. Can you believe it? We went a wee bit of depth, obviously in the last maybe 2 weeks ago, about Ferguson's rage at the Madrid exit. Little did we know then that would be his last bit of Champions League action as a manager. And his farewell speech, and you need to get behind the manager and all that. Well, it wouldn't last long, would it? David Moyes was out on his arse by April. The league form, especially over the winter, I think was as bad as it got in those kind of 80s and Nadir days, David. I think they went out the FA Cup early as well to Swansea, if I'm right. But the Champions League wasn't dreadful. They topped their group. But as is tradition, David, Manchester United got a very Manchester United group. The aforementioned Real Sociedad with 1 point, Shakhtar Donetsk and Bayer Leverkusen, and not the best version, it must be said, of Bayer Leverkusen. I think they finished fourth that year, absolutely not pulling up any trees. But they did top the group nonetheless. His transfer action, Marouane Fellaini came in that summer. I think Juan Mata came in a bit later on that season, but doomed by showing videos of Everton to Rio Ferdinand and how he wanted them defend and all that.
Yes, always somebody who almost seemed in awe of the position, really. I remember at an early press conference him telling journalists that he hadn't sat in Sir Alex's chair. He'd had a new chair brought in the office, and some of the journalists sort of looking at each other and saying, Then some strange comments about Rooney. Do you remember the start of the season? There was a bit of fuss because he said, possibly in an unguarded moment, there was interest in Rooney. I think Rooney was pushing for one of his periodical wage increases, and he said, no, Wayne's important. If anything should happen to Robin, we would need Wayne. And of course, thus saying that Rooney was the backup striker, which did not go down well. But in this group stage, they are very, very good indeed. They get off to a flying start with a 4-2 victory over Bayer Leverkusen. Point away in Donetsk is not a bad result, and then they come back and they beat Sociedad at home. Goal after 2 minutes, an OG, and then nothing. Games like that can be quite tense. A 0-0 over there in Spain, and they're all but through at this point because they're in such a strong position. But the possibly the most impressive result of David Moyes' time there, a 5-0 victory over Bayer Leverkusen in Germany. I think genuinely could well be the highlight of his time as manager there, and they're very, very good, rounding off with a victory over Shakhtar in the last match, although by then things were done. But yes, we spoke about this last week with Ferguson. He was not leaving a strong side, and I think that has almost been it's become such a thing in English football. It's become such a totemic thing that when Klopp stepped down, he made a big thing of, this is a good squad. I'm leaving a good squad, and there's a good batch of youngsters as well. You've heard this before. Wenger said he was leaving a good squad, but of course he was leaving a Wenger squad, which was tailored entirely around him. But he at least thought he was leaving a good squad. Ferguson will never admit to this, but I think he knew that there wasn't a lot of long-term value in it. United's transfer business, though, that summer, Martin, was really poor. They were very slow in the market. Famously, with Marouane Fellaini, he had a clause in his contract that expired at the end of July, when United could have got him cheaper, which Moyes had to know about. And because they were targeting certain other players at the time, they didn't go for him until August. So they ended up paying more. Now, given what we've seen from Manchester United's business in the decade following this, that goes down as an epochal high point of Manchester United's transfer business. But it really was a portent of things to come. However, in this group stage, they're playing with that assurance, confidence. And let's not forget they are the English champions. It's very, very hard because it's almost like Ferguson's departure, with hindsight to us now, places that it's almost like, right, that year, boom, ends. And we know what happens from then on. And we know United's will basically spiral to where they sit in the summer of 2025. But we didn't at the time. And you're right, the early league form was not great. Moyes was already showing signs of pressure. I remember him complaining about the start he'd got, the random fixture computer. He cast aspersions about its randomness, which is slightly strange to do. But there's an excellent book on him by Jamie Jackson of the Guardian, which is about his first season and Van Gaal's first season in detail. And he was up close, obviously, as the Manchester correspondent for the Guardian. And Moyes just never really seemed comfortable. Was totally in awe of the man who he was following in the door, and didn't have the confidence to change enough, and didn't have the confidence to put his own seal on it. And again, this is maybe easy with hindsight, lads. I don't know what you two think. It's easy for me to say, oh, he should have done this, he should have done that, because I know the outcome. But they were the champions, and they have the aura still that is no longer here now. That might be difficult for younger listeners to imagine, but they were the champions. They had this aura, but he just never really seemed entirely comfortable. Although, to be fair, it had long been a thing said about Alex Ferguson. You'd like to be the guy after the guy, although as it turned out, that wasn't the dream job either.
or five after that. I'd love to go back and just look at that kind of contemporaneous writing, Adam, around that departure. My sense is that Moyes very popular with the written press, and therefore, and he's British, and continuity and that kind of thing being sold. I think the response was quite positive. I'll be honest, and I didn't buy it for the reasons that David's mentioned, not being smart after the fact. It's a huge club, and although they were champions, creaking, I think it's probably easy to say, and he just wasn't big enough. And who has been big enough for, over the last 12, 13 years? But it certainly wasn't the guy who kind of yo-yoed with Everton every season. Your memories of that?
And had won
nothing. And, it's just impossible to compare almost with the world of 1986, but Ferguson at least pulled up trees with Aberdeen, big trees, European trees, and therefore came with something that allowed him those few years credit and kind of rebuilding a different world in the summer of 2013. And I do wonder, and this is obviously something we could never say because we're not clinically able to make that qualification, but I always do wonder about whether Ferguson genuinely wanted someone to come in and be a success, or that kind of. Mourinho went to Chelsea, for example, that summer. I don't think he would have liked that, and he chose a successor, which is a dreadful idea as well.
Yeah, in hindsight, probably quite quickly after the season started, I guess. There were certainly concerns, but thinking about it now, it's mad, because you talk about 1986 to 2013, very long span of time. Football moved on hugely. It's moved on a lot in the 13 years since, even David Moyes being appointed. I don't think that would ever happen now. There's just not many. I know he is literally still a manager, but
I'm very good at the level.
Level, I think, is the point. But I would also say as well, he's adapted. I think he's not quite what he was at Everton. I mean, Villa played. We're not talking about a tactical masterclass or anything here, but Villa had decent players. Obviously, the money helps. He was scrimping and saving it at Everton. Not Villa, sorry, West Ham. He did some decent things there, but he's not this sort of tactical genius that, as we've been saying for a long time, that's coming very, very quickly with Guardiola and Klopp, and it's pretty much every year since it has jumped on leaps and bounds. You could argue much more than maybe even the decade before, as far as England is concerned. So it's never going to happen now for a lot of reasons, he's not got the aura that that Man United really needed there to change this. He's not the bright young thing as much as I totally take Martin's point. There probably would have been a lot of journalists that like, oh yeah, this is ideal. This will be great. We'll get someone we like in, lots of good quotes. That's how journalists work, I guess. It's not who's the right person for this job. It's more
And I
often
think
than
they
not.
genuinely wanted to
who's
believe in that story. That would be good. It would be not going to buy Mourinho in, or in the next big thing.
trying to
This
be
is what
different.
Manchester United is all about. Yeah, this kind of thinking long term, and this is good, and it's British and blah blah blah.
Well, it also though sets I think, and again, this is us looking back, but I think we can point and trace. To me, this is symbolic of a club who, in the intervening years, take the wrong lessons from things. Even then, I have to admit, I did think, are they going for him because of what he's done, or are they going for him because he's a dour Scotsman who, honestly, because he
Yeah.
fits, and they're like, what we need is this sort of gruff, earthy, can communicate with the fans person, rather than, as Adam says, kind of, sticking the finger up in the air to detect the way the winds were going. And United had terrible timing when they were looking for managers, didn't they, over the few years for when they were available. The summers they could have got Guardiola, they could have got Klopp. They weren't looking for a manager. The summers they were looking for managers, they got David Moyes, they got Louis van Gaal, who, again, taking the wrong lesson. Oh, right, well, we need a big European coach who was innovative. Yeah, he was innovative 20 years ago. It's symbolic to me, or emblematic rather, of a club who take the wrong lessons continually
Don't know what they're doing,
from what's going on in football. Absolutely. And with Moyes, other than, as Martin pointed out, the previous manager wanted him, which never ever do that. And the fact that character-wise there were similarities, some, by the way, and a lot of them were surface. The Ferguson's famed for his decisiveness. Moyes is known in transfers in particular for his indecisiveness. And then this was a guy who had not handled players of this level, who had not been involved in transfer decisions of this level, who had no Champions League experience, and he does do quite well here, that's true, but it doesn't fit at all, other than the fact that he is a Scotsman who the manager liked. And I think there was some surprise. What I will say is, you're both right about the press, contemporaneous press, kind of fell the way you would expect it to, which is the tabloids were very pro this. You would get some think pieces in the broadsheets. But one thing that is very noticeable, they turned on him quickly, and he was not used to the level of attention. And as I say, every utterance leading every news broadcast and back page. And it shrank him, and we saw it at Sociedad, and we saw it at Sunderland. It took him a long time to recover to, I think, now is a very well-respected manager at the level he's at. We saw the impact he had on his return to Everton, for example, but he is not a top six manager.
Do you know what I find really funny? The way that the way that, I guess, talking about my initial point, I guess, about how football's moved on, it was, in my opinion, the next big thing type thing, or he could be the next Alex Ferguson, and could do this and could do that. He was in his 50s when they appointed him. Like, not a young guy. At that time, if he was 50, Ruben Amorim, even Fabian Hürsler at Brighton, etc. Just now, he could not far off be their dad at that point. Never mind now. It's just moved on so much that is kind of gone. For better or worse, what style of football you play now is of more importance to bigger clubs than trophies that you've won. Now, Moyes didn't have either of those things, but all that stuff we talk about,
he didn't have a brand.
All that stuff you talk about hadn't been involved in to this level and this or that. It's mad when you think about it that happened. Really, it is just basically the endorsement of someone else, and you can't say it's
someone who absolutely controlled the club. I mean, again, I haven't checked back in this, but it's my memory back to that press support of him. There was just a support of him in general about getting a big job. He'd done well with Everton, was the narrative, and he had every
Yeah,
other season because it seemed to yo-yo quite a bit. They're either
which you can
fighting
do there,
relegation
and
or
you
getting to the
can't
Champions
do
League. Yeah,
which you can do
but
there.
it's like he deserves, and British managers are not getting the opportunity. So there was that kind of narrative around generally. So that supported his cause as well. I think Fellaini was a very, very symbolic signing of what he was bringing in. You know, Adam, you're talking about style and just being so out of kilter with where football's going, and this battering ram that he brings with him and fannies about. You know, it's a saga, of course it is. And yeah. David Moyes replacing Sir Alex Ferguson and Ed Woodward replacing David Gill in the same summer. Quite possibly both are of as equal importance as the other in terms of how that club was run, in terms of the overall structure and everything being in sync with it. But yeah, they did the biz in this group again. A very kind Champions League group, it must be said, by Leverkusen going up as well.
And as poor a Spanish side as you're going to be fortunate enough to come up against, that is very rarely will you see that in modern. You won't. In fact, you won't. I'll go out on a limb. We are not going to see a Spanish team get 1 point in the next few years.
Yeah. One poor Spanish side, one very good Spanish side. Adam, it's Real Madrid without Jose Mourinho. He has left. The gaffer, the manager, Carlo Ancelotti, is at Madrid now. And a fair bit of good shopping. When Real Madrid have a good summer, Adam, they tend to have a good season. Wow, there's logic there. But we've talked before about clubs who goes, right, that's a really smart bit of business. I mean, Danny Carvajal, for all you can mock, has been a servant for them. Casemiro clearly has been a successful player for them. Isco, I think, could have been better, as much as everybody loved him in this particular point in time. But of course, for €100 million, Gareth Bale was the signing of the summer, and he would repay that. I think it's fair to say, and then some. But yeah, get good players in, smart signings, one big hitter, a few very sensible ones, and a manager who can just keep them ticking over. And that's kind of how it all went. But the Bale thing, Adam, Spurs sold Elvis and bought the Beatles, or 7 Beatles. I think they bought
Bootleg
7 players
Beatles.
with that. Yeah. Can anyone remember who the 7 were?
Soldado,
Nasser
Big Bobby,
Chadley,
yeah.
Ericsson,
Nasser Chadley, yeah.
Ericsson. Who was the Brazilian lad in midfield?
Sandro?
Nah, it's Paulinho, who was very much thought of, but he was garbage and he went to Barcelona and then was on loan. I'm pretty sure he's Al Hilal now, yeah. I'm sure. The Romanian, Churches.
I didn't mind him.
Etienne Capoue. And I don't know if he wears mascara or just has a kind of natural haunting eyes, but Eric Lamela being the other one who I really did think was going to be good for Spurs. But yeah, can you put Gareth Bale into kind of context, Adam, at where football is in 2013? Athletic, skillful, pace to burn. Big time player as well.
Yeah, I think you've sort of nailed it. We mentioned this last season. Can't remember what episode. Sorry, but about this sort of in-between phase, if you like, of tiki-taka hasn't quite just finished now, I would say, if you want to talk about Barcelona, certainly. But it's not quite finished enough for it to be embedded across Europe yet, and other teams. But you're sort of seeing the rise of, I guess, the gegenpressing, as we mentioned, absolutely. But then the sort of transitional piece as well. Both Real Madrid and Atletico Madrid coming to the fore, playing the kind of 4-4-2, certainly in Atletico's case, of this transition piece. I think in essence, Gareth Bale's perfectly suited to that. because he's just phenomenal ball carrier, phenomenal pace, power, energy, fantastic finisher, just kind of perfect for the sort of 4-2-3-1 transition football that Madrid had been playing essentially under Mourinho, but just given that little bit of leeway, I don't imagine Mourinho and Bale at this point would have really dovetailed very nicely. I don't think Mourinho would have dovetailed very nicely with anyone at Madrid had he still been here this summer. But in Ancelotti, you've got the perfect antidote, I would say. Coming in, you can just imagine them coming in that summer and the whole place going, thank God, here he comes. Thank God, after 3 years of getting screamed at every day, here he comes. So yeah, I think Bale suits that really perfectly. That whole counter attack piece. I've said before, Madrid's counter attacking isn't something that I would expect or want them to be doing as a big club. I think you need to go and dominate the game. But in this landscape, this not quite post tiki taka, I think it's ideal because as we see football evolves and it's cyclical. Don't know how to say that. And it is that perfect antidote to it. And I think this season probably acts as that nice little gateway into the Guardiola Klopp era that we're talking about. So yeah, I think he's a perfect player for Madrid. They have a really tidy team this year. I think it's a really impressive setup. They do really well. Obviously, they've got Atletico Madrid coming hot on their heels all the way through as well, which again makes it really interesting. That derby, we spoke about Barcelona and Real Madrid getting to the points of it. You kind of forgot about this coming up so soon after it. It isn't really something that we see huge amounts of. So for it to happen this season and to get a really good performance from both Madrid clubs in the league and in the Champions League was great, I think.
I mean, Bale scored that winner in the Copa del Rey against Barcelona, didn't he? When he went off the pitch and still managed to run back on it and pick up the ball and just zoom towards goal.
It was incredible.
Yeah, so, I mean, Real Madrid scooshed this group, David, 16 points, 5 wins and a draw, of course. Cristiano Ronaldo, just the 9 goals in 6 games. FC Copenhagen at the bottom, and it's Juve and Galatasaray who are the others. And going into that last game, Juve are 2 points ahead going to Turkey. But Galatasaray win. Wesley Sneijder, and again, this combination of old pros like Schneider and Drogba, Mourinho veterans, and some really nice young Turks, literally young Turks. They're still dangerous, and a Juve team who are getting into a very consistent championship winning groove, Davey, but yet again, miss out.
Yeah, they draw themselves out of this competition, and I would posit the reason for that is yes, and I would posit the reason for that was their front line. They have now got in place this great midfield that will be the hub of the Conte era of early success, and they have, of course, I think it almost goes without saying, they have a fabulous defence and goalkeeper. However, they up front they have Carlos Tevez for it to see, and he has a good season for them in goals. But the next most prolific for them is Fernando Llorente, the Spaniard, who is not really a kind of what we would assume for this era Spanish player. He's more of a target man type, more in the kind of Julio Salinas. That's who he brought to mind for me. And they are a good side. At home, they're very functional. They win a lot of games by 1-0s and 2-0s, and they're hard to beat. They're hard to get the ball off in the middle of the park, but they aren't prolific up top. And I think at the higher level, that is Champions League, we see this. It's a late goal and a heartbreaking goal in Turkey for them, because they are 5 minutes away from the point that will do the job for them, but they concede. But again, there was a sort of a conservatism to these early Conte sides. There's always a practicality. I think we're post his Spurs spell, there is always a practicality to a Conte team. But this one in particular was still a bit of a work in progress. Now, they had found the cracked the code to win Serie A. This is not a strong Serie A, by the way. I have to say that, but they were capable of doing enough most weeks to get the points because they did have this fabulous midfield. They were solid at the back, but Tevez apart, there is an element of who's going to finish this season with 10 goals in the squad. And in the Champions League, it bites them. They can't put away teams that they absolutely should have. They can't put away matches that they absolutely should have. And as I say, the last game, they do get slightly caught, Martin, between, do we go for this? We only need a draw. Galatasaray, I know you and I have often speculated about this. It's sometimes simpler to know, right, we need to win. That's all that matters. And they chuck, and of course the tension as the game goes on is huge. And then by the end, Galatasaray just chuck absolutely everything for them. And for those of you who maybe haven't seen any of this, I go back and watch the highlights on YouTube. The time wasting and shithousery from Galatasaray when they get in the last few minutes after they get the goal is truly magnificent. I mean, it's textbook. In fact, it's not textbook. It should be studied by all teams on how to turn 10 minutes into about 90 seconds of actual play. And Juventus lose their head a little bit during this period. They start forcing it and never really look likely. But yeah, for me, it was a functional side that when it needed that extra level, it just didn't have it. And you see this, they don't have a terrible campaign. They're not, getting severe doings or anything like that, but nor is it good enough. And then at the last, they pay the price for not putting away matches previously.
Apologies if we've done this, Adam, but why is he so bad in Europe?
I was just about to say that. He's rubbish in the Champions League, has a terrible record. I think at this time, obviously, he's maybe his second Champions League season, so there's not really going to be many takes about it at the point. But even up to present day, he's won 2 knockout games in the Champions League in 13 years, and both of them against Celtic. Both of them against Celtic, which doesn't really count.
With big clubs as well.
But I think what he, I don't know if it's it can't be circumstances because it's happened 3 times now. Took over at Juventus, took over at Chelsea, took over at Napoli. Don't think it's any coincidence that those 3 seasons he won the league in his first season, and they were so bad the year before they didn't qualify for any European football. So he gets the full week to shout at his players. Basically, I just don't know. It's something when we get to the Premier League show. Obviously it'll be quite a while into it, but when we get to the Premier League show, it'll be really interesting to dive into that Chelsea 2016? 2016, 2017?
He got 16-17 because he leaves Juve at the end of the season, doesn't he? He goes to take the Italy job to Euro 2016, which is meh.
I can't I keep going to say I'm not a huge fan of him, and I don't quite get there. Because I do like the way that the team's set up. It is very inflexible what he does, but it works. I think certainly as far as the back threes and certainly as far as the midfields go. On the wing back areas, it's a lot of making do with what you've got at times. I think he does very well at Juve with what he's got here, absolutely. But then at Chelsea, we mentioned Victor Moses plugging in. I think that's admirable and great in a way that you can fashion something like that, but you're pushing players into positions and getting a huge amount out of them rather than looking for specialists. So I think it's a different kind of skill for cup competitions, maybe, that you want the specialists in those positions rather than it's almost like Moneyball, isn't it? We'll get Victor Moses in there because we need a fullback that can hammer up and down, basically.
Yeah.
And it's fine, but maybe on the bigger stage, the spread of attributes that someone like that, and I didn't really mean to call him out and slate him overall when we're talking about Juventus, but the spread of attributes maybe aren't there. And it's the same with maybe Liechtensteiner or Kwadi Azamo was at this point, I think, for Juve. So yeah, maybe it's just a little bit of that. They're really solid defense, midfield, okay in attack. I think I would say for Conte teams, the Inter
Yeah,
certainly they had coming up to
they're practical. Yeah, even
practical,
up front, they're
functional, well
practical.
drilled.
Yeah, even this Napoli side is built around Scott McTominay, who's a big rampaging attacking midfielder. The other thing is there's a joylessness to Conte's football. Now,
Definitely.
I'm not an art project guy, right? I'm not a Wenger disciple of, yeah, but look how good we are when it clicks. I like people who win, but I do think it's quite interesting that the clubs that he's been at, there's respect for Conte among fan base, but very rarely love, and that's maybe telling.
So I like
Isn't he
I like the
just?
system. I like the system. I like the style of football that you mentioned there, but I also have a bit of love for the system trumps everything else type thing, and I think Conte is that guy. You could again, would people say Conte was an ideologue? I do think that word gets used for people that want to play beautiful football in a beautiful way. We've had that argument before. I would put him as an ideologue of a different caliber because it's here is my system. I don't care what I've got squad wise. Here is what I'm playing, and I will force people into the positions that I want.
Well, that was the thing with Chelsea, wasn't it? He dropped that. They got utterly spanked at the Emirates. And he said,
A bit of
"Fuck
wasn't it?
this.
Yeah.
We're going back
Yeah.
to three at the back, and I'm not moving." And they go in this incredible because he was teetering
That's fascinating.
on the
That
brink.
is
He
fascinating.
could have got absolutely binned. Given we're talking about Chelsea at this, we know what they're like, and he goes in this mad run and wins the title. Is he not just a Mourinho with a football that's just a wee bit more suited to the era he's in? That
Yes,
murder
he is.
ball. Players can't wait for him to fucking go, let's be
No,
honest.
grind. He's very like Mourinho Martin in terms of people are shattered when he leaves the club, and I don't mean
Yeah.
that in a
Not like
mental capacity. I
not
mean
like
just
Materazzi
tired
at the
because
after that Champions League final, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just that he demands so much, as we know, and it's high octane. And let's be honest, he is a bit of a diva, right? You don't fall out with as many people at as many clubs as he's done over the years if you're not. There was even talk of him leaving Napoli this summer, wasn't there? After clinching the league, they had to have the big clear their talks. He's a difficult person. He is very demanding, but he is very good in practical short-term title building, so he builds something that is required and it gets him over the line. They're not a side, or none of his sides are sides that are playing 4-5-0 victories every week, swashbuckling football. Or even, to be honest, look, that raw athleticism that's totally overpowering the opposition. They do enough. He's a master of getting teams that do enough. And yeah, he's an odd one. He really is. He, I mean, even he, who's a serial league winner, couldn't do anything for Tottenham. So there's that. But yeah, a very, very interesting character. Almost hard to define, really. But I think you're spot on with the Mourinho comparison. I think he's um, I think he's a cousin of Jose's style and thought processes. Yes.
I haven't thought about it
Yeah.
before, but I guess the Italian version of Mourinho would be something that I
Yeah.
think is a fit because he has more of a what's the word, structure, a set, defined, forced tactical structure, Catenaccio vibes, whereas Mourinho is much more flexible, albeit still that cautiousness coming through, but he's not wedded to one system or one formation with that. So yeah, I think an Italian version of it probably just about works for me. Yep.
Cool. Let's head on then. Group C, Paris Saint-Germain, not a huge amount of difficulty. 4 wins, a draw, and a defeat, and that defeat coming in the very last game where they were already through. Cavani added to that squad, Adam. Again, did a good shift for them. Who's managing them now? Because obviously Ancelotti's Real Madrid?
Laurent Blanc it is this year.
Laurent Blanc, of course, and there's a bit of a merry-go-round, isn't it? But yeah, they've kind of got their Champions League group shit together. We will pick them up again in some quarterfinal heartbreak later on. Anderlecht rock bottom, and Olympiacos again. So many Greek friends in this history show, and Benfica battling out for that second place. And it's Olympiacos that just do it. They have the better of them in that little middle couple of games, a 1-1 draw in Lisbon and a 1-0 win in Greece. But yeah, again, David, very fitting how many times we've talked about this in our final season. The Greeks bear gifts once more.
Yeah, and there's some famous names on this side. The Fulham legend that is Kostas Mitroglou is there, and reliably banging them in, as he always did.
Mm-hmm.
But also Javier Saviola, much fancied player from his time at Barcelona. There's also Joel Campbell. Do you remember the perennially loaned out Costa Rican from Arsenal, who had that great World Cup in 2014 with Costa Rica, but Wenger just never seemed to play him. But he's there as well. And yeah, it comes down to head-to-heads. They had won their home match and then drew the opposite, so they're comfortably ahead on that, 4 points to 1. And they know that going into the last round. But there are some really good players on the side. There's obviously the Greek contingent, and it's the names that you kind of would expect. Kostas Manolis, for example, Papadopoulos, the captain. But the midfield is a real Argentinian tinge with Ariel Ebagazza and Saviola in there making things happen. But this is always, I think, the one where you get cheesed off if you're those two teams. There is someone who's going to win it, and there is someone who's going to get their arse handed to them every week. And you know that 10 points might not be enough. And I mean, my heart does go out to a side who get 10 points and don't qualify, which is the fate of Benfica this year. But this is actually a well put together side. And again, they're in the midst of one of those runs as well. I think this was their 4th title in a row that year. So a side that's used to winning, confident, has good Champions League experience, and again has a good balance. You've got that. I mean, we're not that far. We know what Greek football became famous for in the mid 2000s, understandably. So I mean, we're a decade on, but that influence permeated. They're very solid, but they had goal threats and they had an excellent midfield and. Middle section of groups. We say it so often, but those two head-to-heads, they can be so defining.
Did you mention Roy Carroll there? No,
I did not.
Bizarrely, one appearance this season, but this was his second season there. That's a weird trivia question because I had completely blocked that from all memory.
He didn't feature much. It's fair to say, but they were quite a solid side, but. Again, used to winning. And that's one thing I think that we've maybe underrated with the Greek team who've come into this and done well. I mean, it's generally been one or the other, but they're usually in the midst of a pretty glorious domestic reign, and they tend to take that into the group stages.
One thing that I found a bit weird as well, just looking through some trivia on them earlier on, was Marinakis is there at this point as well. In my head, I just thought he'd been the Olympiacos owner for a few years before Nottingham Forest, but it was like 2008 or something like that. He took over there. You would think that someone, when we're fresh off seeing him in full glory with Morgan Gibbs White doing his press conference, obviously on the stadium with him peering ominously over. You would have thought an owner like that would have made more waves in football before.
Well, he certainly looks. If he did a Robert Maxwell, I'd suggest he'd create a lot of waves. But who knows? Look, well, Adam, I just go back to The Wire. It ran for 5 series with certainly Marlowe got more successful as it went on, and by the end had much more money to spend. So maybe that's true. Yeah, what we should. Yeah, not that I'm accusing them of anything.
Okay, we'll wrap up, of course, with Group D. Now, if Manchester United always get easy groups. At this stage of proceedings, Manchester City must be so for fuck's sake whenever they're drawn in the Champions League. Now, that's half true. CSKA Moscow and Victoria Pilsen basically mean that they will qualify, but any hopes of top spot are made difficult by getting European champions, treble winners, Bayern Munich, who have just added Pep Guardiola to a renewed, a refreshed Pep Guardiola. Been kicking about New York City for a lot of the year before, learning German, watching cows, whatever the fuck he does, and his years off. Mario Götze is there now, of course. Who's Thiago as well. Loved Thiago. If only could stay fit, etc., etc. But yeah, Bayern. We'll talk about. I think it's fair to say in due course. Adam, though, City have jumped on the Malaga success, and Manuel Pellegrini is now in charge. Roberto Mancini unceremoniously kind of dumped before an FA Cup final defeat to Wigan in the rain in Wembley and all of that. And again, a good summer. They'll go on and win the league. But in terms of signings, Fernandinho comes in that summer. Jesus Navas comes in that summer. Both would make a contribution. Fernandinho's contribution would be pretty huge. Negredo and Jovetic is slightly more peripheral. But again, to be fair to City, they have learned they can only be separated on goal difference. Bayern beat them at home, but City beat Munich in the Allianz, so it's 15 points apiece, and it's just a bit of goal difference actually that does the biz, I think. So yeah, it's an improved City. They're getting the hang of the Champions League a wee bit, even though they're continually coming up against some tough opposition.
Yeah, they are. I like this City team at the time. It's funny how things move on, because you look at some of the squad now here that are getting huge amounts of minutes, and you think there's no chance that, even I know City are not in great fettle right now, but some of these names that are there, you think, almost can't believe they played for Manchester City, which is funny how things move on. I'd even go maybe a little bit harsh, but even I'd go as far as some of the managers. I don't think Mark Hughes, for example, just a couple of years before this, just seems like light years ago. Yes, they are good. Sergio Aguero, I was a massive fan of from his time in Spain. I'm not a massive Spanish football follower. Certainly, I think my Spanish football following probably cut off literally this summer with Guardiola going, in terms of watching it religiously. But obviously, seeing a lot of Barcelona and being more interested in this phase, Aguero was great. Someone that I really, really liked. David Silva we've mentioned as well. That sort of, he's been there a while now, but that sort of wave of players that came over, your Matas and your Silvas, and almost forgot his name there, Santi Cazorla coming over. So those type of guys, I think, particularly for City, Negredo, Silva, Jesus Navas, are a bit of a mishmash. I think you can say Silva suits it quite well. The other two, certainly now, you couldn't imagine some of those signings being made. So there's the money. How would you describe it? That they've obviously got all the money, and they're still trying to find their way, I think, as a club, despite it being a few years further on. There's not quite a cohesiveness about it, I think, despite the amount of money being spent. And yeah, I don't want to talk about it as like stumbling around in the dark until the Messiah comes a couple of years later, but there is a bit of a feel about it sometimes with it. I know they win the league this year, and they are obviously doing very well. But yeah, it feels like a bit of a. It's almost like that in my head. They're on a little bit of a pause until basically from Robinho signing until Guardiola comes in, which is wildly unfair. But yeah, they're in a weird place, I think, at this point.
I just think from Mancini coming in and winning that FA Cup and then winning the league, I mean, they nearly fucked the league, as we know, but they ultimately won it. They've then found themselves in England, and they'll win this league. They'll obviously win again under Pellegrini, won't they? So they know that. It just, takes a while, and it took Guardiola, as we know, famously, a long while to get to grips with the Champions League in City. And do they really have the players that just make that absolute difference at the elite level, head-to-heads and, knockout football at that level? I'm just not sure they did, as much as I loved Kun Aguero, Yaya Toure.
I think that's probably where my head. I think that's probably where my head's at as well. There's still a gap at this point, and quite a big gap, I think, of good to very good Premier League player versus great Champions League player. Now, I think that gap is pretty much gone now in present day, outside of what, maybe 3 or 4 players that you could say, but I'm not sure at this point. Like, I'm not sure Man City would go into a game against Atletico Madrid in 2014 and be absolutely battle them, like no doubt about it. So the gap is increasing. The gap is decreasing, and I think Man City probably summed that up. I think you've nailed that. There's good to very good in the Premier League, and let's be honest, we've spoken about the Premier League that there's not really much in the way of consistent competition. United are dipping down. Chelsea will be going through their Chelsea. Liverpool are still so there's not much competition, but there's not sustained competition. So it's just that next step, I think, for me is the thing at this stage. Yeah, definitely.
I think there's a wider discussion, not for this show, maybe for our next series and far into it, how often the Premier League or a Premier League club has been able to sign a genuine elite player at the top of their game who isn't in the need of some kind of career resuscitation, isn't just a hot prospect, but genuine top billing. I don't think there's many, actually. The world-class players that the Premier League have had are either English and therefore have come through that system. They've got them young, Cristiano Ronaldo, for example. They've resurrected careers. I'm thinking just off the top of my head, Bergkamp and Henry, who had failed in Italy and come back and flourished. But it's, I think, the City and Guardiola, Adam. Haaland probably is one that does kind of stand out as being, there you are, that boy is almost a finished article. He's wanted all over Europe, and he's gone there. It's actually not as common as we maybe think. I think they develop players into kind of world-class players, and that goes against the grain a wee bit about what we think the Premier League is some kind of mercenary fairground, where actually there's probably a good record that its best players, its most elite players, have not always arrived fully formed with the fanfare and all the kind of hoopla. And the death of Serie A clearly impacted that, but we know there are 2 clubs, you can add PSG and Bayern Munich to that list, who can always outbid, be more attractive, whatever else. But again, a story for another day. Thank you, gentlemen. That's halfway through 13-14 group stage. Cheers, David.
Pleasure as always, guys.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Some giants still to come next week. 7 former winners of the Champions League or European Cup still to talk about, and a little horse as well. Until next time, bye for now. If you enjoyed the show and want to help us grow, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. On YouTube, search for And It's Live Podcast. We've got new deep dives, drafts and breakdowns dropping every other day.